Now I will present Madame Kristel Smentek, with my French pronunciation, I'm sorry. And Madame Smentek is a scholar first interested with decorative arts and the links with the East, and she did an exhibition at the Frick Collection in New York in 2007, Rococo Exotique. And also she wrote several articles about prints in different symposiums. And then now she's, she was aware with Mariette, a very big subject, and she published a very, very interesting book in 2014, Mariette and the Connoisseurship, and the science of the connoisseurship. And now she's professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And she will present to us a paper, Bouchardon, Mariette, and the Pure Taste of the Antique.
Thank you very much, and thank you also to the organizers for the invitation to participate. It's a real pleasure to be here. So sometime soon after his return to Paris from Rome in 1733, Edmé Bouchardon met the print dealer, graphic arts collector, and art connoisseur Pierre-Jean Mariette. Thus began a lifelong friendship between the sculptor and the man who would champion Bouchardon and his work for the rest of his life. From his defense of Bouchardon's Fountain of the Four Seasons on the Rue de Grenelle, published in 1746, to his pamphlet on the Cupid carving a bow, published in 1750, and in many other texts besides, Mariette consistently identified Bouchardon's work as exemplifying the pure taste of the antique, and more specifically, that of ancient Greek art. And today I'd like to examine what Mariette and his associates understood Greek art to be, and I'd like to approach this question through Mariette and Bouchardon's shared study of ancient engraved gems, a study that culminated in the landmark publication, the Traité des Pierres Gravées, or Treatise on Engraved Gems, issued in 1750. In this book, Mariette and his collaborators, Bouchardon among them, articulated for a wide audience the distinguishing characteristics of ancient Greek, Roman, and Etruscan art. And in an era when many continued to follow the Roman writer Pliny the Elder in equating nudity with Greek works and drapery with Roman productions, Mariette's publication represented a significant advance in the stylistic analysis of ancient art. By differentiating Greek from Roman art and supplying images as evidence of their claims, Mariette and his associates also sought to empirically prove the long-held but purely substantiated belief in the superiority of Greek art, and also to promote its significance as a model for contemporary practice. The treatise is thus a key text for understanding what the pure taste of ancient Greek art was imagined to be in the middle decades of the 18th century. Though a genre of ancient art less familiar to us now, engraved gems were a subject of intense interest to 18th century collectors and scholars. Engraved gems are small, usually semi-precious stones with images either carved in relief, these are known as cameos, or with designs incised or engraved below their surface, and the latter are known as intaglios. And historically, intaglios were often mounted as rings and used as seals with their images when impressed on clay or wax, serving as a form of signature. In the 18th century, these small antiquities became prized collector's items and the subject of many illustrated publications, several of which were in Bouchardon's library. The widespread interest in this period in intaglios stimulated a renewal of the art of gem engraving itself. And Louis XV's mistress, Madame de Pompadour, for instance, commissioned engraved gems, some based on designs by Bouchardon, and she also engraved gemstones herself. And on the left, you see here two views of a gem representing Louis XV's victory at Fontenoy in 1745. That was commissioned by Pompadour and executed by the gem engraver Jacques Gouet. And the model for this was a design for a medal by Bouchardon. And Gouet's gem was represented on the title page of the treatise. It's right, oops, sorry, excuse me. It's right there. For those interested in studying ancient art, intaglios were vital. These tiny, portable monuments of antiquity survived in far greater numbers than did ancient art in other media. Extant ancient statues were often damaged, and virtually no ancient paintings survived. With engraved gems, by virtue of their small scale and incised surfaces, they generally survived intact. And intaglios were additionally useful because they could also be multiplied by making impressions of them in wax, sulfur, or plaster. And in this truly wonderful anonymous painting, probably from the 1780s, you can see the sitter is inspecting a plaster cast of a gem, magnifying glass in hand. And just a detail, casts of intaglios made antiquity accessible, and they easily circulated among collectors across the continent, often in pre-formed collections contained in cabinets with drawers, as you see here. Mariette's treatise on engraved gems represented a new approach to the study of intaglios, and its achievements continue to be acknowledged by specialists today. This exhaustive two-volume study featured substantial texts by Mariette and his collaborators, and also over 200 illustrations of the choicest gems in the French royal collection, the majority of which were based on drawings by Bouchardon. And you see one of the drawings here that you can see in the exhibition and its corresponding print. In contrast to most other antiquarian texts of the period, in the treatise, Mariette and his associates focused on the styles of ancient art rather than its iconography. And from their comparative visual analysis of hundreds of ancient gems, they sought to clearly determine the characteristics that distinguished Greek from Roman art, and to begin to account for those differences, the differences between the two. So this is the title page for the second volume of the treatise. This was also designed by Bouchardon. The project for the treatise on engraved gems was likely first conceived in the 1720s in the circle of art connoisseurs that gravitated around the financier Pierre Crozat. Crozat is familiar to scholars today as the most important collector of drawings in Paris in the first half of the 18th century. Less well known is the fact that he was also an important collector of engraved gems. In addition to the over 19,000 artist sheets he owned, Crozat had also amassed about 1,400 engraved gems. Until his death in 1740, Crozat held regular gatherings at his hotel in which his guests studied drawings and antiquities from his collection. Like drawings, most intaglios were unsigned, and classifying them depended on the close visual scrutiny of the objects themselves. And the Crozat group focused their attention on questions of attribution and stylistic differentiation between artists and regional schools, and they then made their findings public in a number of celebrated, often illustrated publications. Bouchardon, whose reputation as a sculptor and draftsman preceded him, almost certainly participated in Crozat's assemblies after his return to Paris in 1733. And there, Bouchardon would have socialized with such prominent members of the French art world as the antiquarian Comte de Caylus, the painter and future director of the Academy of Painting and Sculpture, Charles-Antoine Coppel, the gem engraver Gouet, and many others besides. And it was almost certainly through Crozat's associates that Bouchardon met Mariette, who by the 1730s had become one of Crozat and Caylus's closest collaborators. Bouchardon and Mariette seem to have developed a particularly close relationship. At the Salon exhibition of 1737, the artist showed two larger-than-life-size red chalk drawings of Mariette's son and daughter, and very fortunately, happily, one of these drawings has really just come to light, and on the screen you see it. This is Mariette's 4-year-old daughter, Geneviève, and on the left you see the inscription on the back of the mount of the drawing, which identifies her, and the inscription is in Mariette's hand. When Bouchardon died many years later, in 1762, he bequeathed a painting by Charles-Antoine Coppel of a Virgin and Child to Mariette's wife, whom the sculptor affectionately referred to as, quote, my dear godmother. Bouchardon and Mariette exchanged gifts of drawings and favors throughout their lives, with the sculptor giving Mariette many of his own drawings, even devising a title page for a portfolio of his gifts, as you see here. Bouchardon also gave Mariette drawings by others, including this one by Pierre Le Gros, mounted by Mariette in his characteristic blue mat and identified by him at bottom as a gift from Bouchardon. The sculptor also restored at least 2 ancient marble busts in Mariette's collection, one of a Roman emperor and another of a philosopher. And the philosopher is likely this Roman bust at the upper right, identified as from Mariette's cabinet when it was published in 1752 in the first volume of the Comte de Caylus' massive illustrated compendium of antiquities, the Recueil d'Antiquités. Mariette, in turn, was an avid promoter and collector of Bouchardon's work. At his death in 1774, Mariette owned over 20 small terracottas by the artist and prodigious numbers of his drawings. Mariette also steered visiting dignitaries and potential clients to Bouchardon's studio and championed Bouchardon's work in his publications, including the Treatise on Engraved Gems, but also in images, such as this crayon manner print by Gilles de Marteau, the print is on the right, after a drawing by Bouchardon in Mariette's collection, and this print was probably published after Bouchardon's death. Bouchardon's will also records his bequest to Mariette of a ring with an antique cameo representing a philosopher, and it's possible that this is the same ring that Bouchardon is wearing on his little finger in François Drouet's portrait of him from 1758. I don't know if you can see it, but it's right there. This gift of the cameo can be taken as a marker of their shared interest in engraved gems. In 1737, in the same salon in which Bouchardon exhibited his portraits of Mariette's children, he also showed his drawing after the so-called Michelangelo's seal, one of the prize objects in the Royal Cabinet of Antiquities at Versailles, and which you can see in the exhibition. And you see that it was mounted with a wax impression of the actual gem. And this is how it was recorded when it was inventoried in Mariette's collection in 1774, and perhaps they were already presented together in 1737. This is the gem itself. You're seeing it here in enormous scale. This is very small. It's 1.2 by 1.5 centimeters, so it's a very small object. Celebrated for its presumed antiquity, the tiny intaglio's prestige also lay in its presumed provenance. It was believed to have once been in Michelangelo's possession, hence its name. The reasoning was that the artist Michelangelo used the 2 female figures seen at right on the gem as models for his depiction of Judith and her maidservant in the Sistine ceiling. So I'm talking about these figures here and these figures here. The gem is now recognized to be a 16th century work, with the gem engraver seemingly emulating Michelangelo rather than the other way around. But at the time that Bouchardon drew it, the seal was assumed to be a masterpiece of ancient Greek art, and his drawing of it visually affirmed claims being made for him as a worthy successor to the artist of the ancient world. Bouchardon's exhibition of the drawing after Michelangelo's seal, the most famous gem in the king's collection, was also an announcement of sorts of Mariette's treatise on engraved gems, which, though not published until 1750, was well underway in 1737. And a proof of one of the title pages designed by Bouchardon for the treatise is dated, right here, 1737, suggesting that the massive work of classification represented by the treatise was progressing and that the project was slowly being readied for the press. When the book was finally published in 1750, the treatise had expanded to fill 2 thick volumes. The first was a comprehensive analysis, over 500 pages long, of the classification, history, and technology of gem engraving from ancient times to the present. And the second volume featured 257 prints after engraved gems in the cabinet, and of these, Bouchardon prepared 194 of the drawings for the printmaker. It was the antiquarian and court noble Caylus who in the 1720s first proposed to issue prints after engraved gems in the royal collection, and it was Caylus who initially prepared etchings after all the king's intaglios. And you see two of Caylus's prints here, including on the right his interpretation of Michelangelo's seal. With this project, Caylus hoped to stimulate the study of intaglios by members of the Académie des Inscriptions, the royal institution dedicated to historical research. Caylus's more particular ambition was to reorient the attention of the academicians away from their antiquarian and philological interests in decoding subject matter and encourage them to, as Caylus put it, to see intaglios as works of art, and thus to apply the methods of connoisseurship to their analysis. Caylus was dissatisfied with his own artistic efforts, and as you can see in the plate on the left where the bottom of the gem is cut off, he also had some technical difficulties translating the small images on gems onto etched plates. He thus gave up, if you will, and gave his plates to Mariette, who had been working on the project from the late 1720s. And at some point after Bouchardon's return to Paris, Caylus called upon the artist to prepare drawings for the gems after the gems for publication. Very, very few of these drawings are extant, although there are three which have recently come to light and are in the exhibition. Here are all three, seen in enormous scale again. And a comparison of these drawings with the prints after them shows that the printmaker Pierre Subéran closely followed Bouchardon's preparatory drawings, and the intaglio you're seeing here was sort of laconically identified as a soldier on duty. And you can see that the engraver occasionally added cross-hatching, as you can see in the shield in the print, and he changed the orientation of the background lines, but he was very faithful to Bouchardon's drawing. And if we look at just one more, this is the drawing in the print after a gem representing Alexander taming Bucephalus, with, as Mariette pointed out, a dubious inscription of the name of the ancient Athenian sculptor Phidias on the bottom of the gem. And Mariette speculated that the inscription and the gem itself was a modern work despite its seemingly Roman style. I would just point out that the prints all have the same measurements as Bouchardon's preparatory drawings, but both the prints and the drawings are significantly larger than the gems they depict. And for this reason, the actual scale of the intaglio represented was included on every print, and that's what this is here, the height and the diameter. Far preferable to Roman engraving, which was derided in the treatise for the heavy draperies of its figures and its crude, unfeeling technique, was the artistic perfection of Greek art. And Greek perfection was best exemplified for Mariette by Michelangelo's seal. In Mariette's view, a view he articulated at length, the clear and unconfused composition of the multi-figured gem, the elegant proportions of its figures, and the gem engraver's light and spiritual touch typified Greek art. The most telling signs, however, of the seal's supposed Greek origin were the pure and flowing contours of the nudes and the marvelous sense of living flesh conveyed. As Mariette wrote, and I'm quoting from his text, "No muscle is forgotten. All are in their place, but they are not allowed to be too visible, nor prominent. Tender and delicate skin gracefully covers and unifies them. It gives the look of flesh." And Mariette described this look of living flesh, the subtle contours, and as he put it, the noble simplicity that he saw in Greek gems, to the Greek artist's unfailing consultation of nature. Unlike the Romans, and implicitly many 18th century French artists who had turned away from the true imitation of nature, the Greeks never lost sight of it. And in making these claims about Greek art, Mariette and his fellow connoisseurs developed the association of subtle contour with Greek art, first articulated by Pliny and subsequently elaborated on by artists and scholars from Giorgio Vasari to the 17th century François Duquesnoy, and then on to the Crozat circle. And they also, as Lola Kantor-Kozowski has recently argued, mapped their study and appreciation of naturalism in Renaissance art and their knowledge of the art theories of such early 18th century writers as Roger de Pile onto the physical evidence of ancient gems. And it is, of course, telling of their reading of the antique through Renaissance art that the pinnacle of ancient Greek art in the treatise is in fact an Italian Renaissance gem. One is led to wonder how much Mariette and his colleagues were actually able to see when they studied intaglios. The evidence they relied on was often barely legible to the naked eye. As we saw earlier, this scrutiny of ancient gems often demanded the use of magnifying glasses, and we know that microscopes were also used to examine them. And I'll just remind you of the scale of Michelangelo's seal. It's 1.2 by 1.5 centimeters. So Bouchardon necessarily enlarged the drawings after the gems for the treatise's illustrations to make them legible. And legibility is also why Bouchardon executed his drawings from casts of the gems, apparently with the sole exception, we're told, of Michelangelo's seal. And just to give you a sense, I'd like to use this example, which is unrelated to the treatise, but just to show you how difficult it can be to decipher images on these extremely small objects. So on the left is a very small Roman gem, and on the right is its plaster cast, and I think you can see that in the plaster cast, details of the image actually start to become visible. And again, just another unrelated example. This is now an 18th century intaglio with its cast, and it shows, I think, quite well how casts evacuated the color and the translucency of gemstones, transforming them instead into pure form, and in a sense, into objects more akin to drawing. In the example on the screen, it's also evident that the qualities of skin, and especially of contour, which preoccupied Mariette, are much more readily visible in the casts than in the gems themselves. So interpreting engraved gems was thus an exercise in projection. As Edouard Kopp points out in the exhibition catalog, in his drawing after Michelangelo's seal, Bouchardon added details such as human expression that are absent from the gem itself, and this is true of many of the other gems he drew. In 1770, Bouchardon's near contemporary, the sculptor Étienne Falconet, recognized the degree to which engraved gems required imaginative interpretation, and he accused Bouchardon of making unattractive gems conform to Mariette's theories. So I'm quoting Falconet. Bouchardon was so filled with the beautiful style of the antique, he studied it so deeply that he could transform even the ugliest Chinese knick-knack into the most beautiful Greek figure. And the mid-19th century scholar of engraved gems, Antoine Chabouillet, dismissed the treatise out of hand. This is what he said. In this book, there are neither ancient gems nor modern gems. There is only Bouchardon, and Bouchardon was a singularly terrible interpreter of the antique. For his mid-18th century admirers, however, Bouchardon's work embodied the pure taste of the antique, by which Mariette meant not only that Bouchardon's art approached the beauty of Greek sculpture, but that it also exemplified the Greek approach to art making as he constructed it. Bouchardon's careful, sustained study of ancient sculpture and his thorough understanding of the processes that resulted in the superiority of Greek art made him uniquely qualified to interpret and thus make visible the truth embedded in ancient intaglios. And as Mariette wrote of an ancient gem that he had acquired in 1765, I'm quoting Mariette, the play of muscles covered in delicate skin, the beauties of its fine and flowing contours, and the sublime character of the heads will not escape an eye enlightened by the contemplation of the truly beautiful, but they are hidden to the eye of anyone who would resort to copying, mere copying, to attempt to capture them. Bouchardon's process also made his art a model for the present. Bouchardon, the new Phidias as he was called, did not forego nature for copying, as for instance the ancient Romans did. He understood that ancient Greek artists achieved their greatest works through the constant study of nature. As Caylus had noted, imitation alone, that is, imitation without the consultation of nature, produces only glace or ice. And icy and cold is notably how Mariette characterized the work of the neoclassical painters Antoine Raphael Mengs and Joseph-Marie Vien. By contrast, Bouchardon's Greek, quote-unquote, approach led to the naturalism of his Cupid carving a bow and of his sculptures for the Grenelle fountain. Both projects were, of course, underway as Bouchardon and Mariette collaborated on the treatise, and both exemplified the subtle flowing contours identified by Mariette and his colleagues in Greek art, and also, as Mariette put it in 1746, the palpable, quote, delicacy and sensibility of flesh under the hardness of the marble. According to Mariette, Bouchardon professed to have learned as much from his studies of ancient intaglios as he did from his studies of antique statuary, and Edouard Kopp has demonstrated that Bouchardon borrowed iconography from the gems he analyzed as well. Conversely, we might also say that in some sense, when Mariette and Caylus looked at what they thought was ancient Greek art, they saw Bouchardon, and that it was Bouchardon who helped them to see the pure taste of ancient Greece. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So I'm very pleased to introduce our last speaker today, Madame Cathy Scott. Madame Cathy Scott is a professor at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. She wrote numerous publications of the 18th century in France. Her book, The Rococo Interieur, Decoration and Social Spaces in Early 18th Century Paris, was published at Yale in 1995 with great critical success. And she wrote also on Boucher, Chardin, Saint-Aubin, and numerous subjects, and also on Bouchardon, with two very seminal articles on the Cupid and the Cri de Paris. And now she will speak about modeling water, Bouchardon, and the fountain at the Rue de Grenelle.
Thank you very much, Guilhem. Thank you to the Getty, particularly Thomas Gatelians and Anne-Lise for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. Oh, my glasses. I won't say. I'll come to it. Okay, modelling water. My subject this morning is not so much Bouchardon's fountain of the Four Seasons in the Rue de Grenelle as the nature of the model and the act of modelling. How do I work this? Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Okay, thank you. It is conventional in art historical scholarship to separate drawings and models. Edouard Kopp's expansive and brilliant study of Bouchardon, the learned draftsman, has left us in no doubt of the importance of drawing to Bouchardon and for the shaping of his reputation in the opinion of his contemporaries. Until the present exhibition, much less attention has been paid to Bouchardon's models. The drawings rank and ranked during Bouchardon's lifetime as autonomous works of art. The models mostly did not. The identification, authentication, classification, restoration, and display of so many of Bouchardon's models in the current exhibition may be about to change their status today. Over a decade ago, Malcom Baker noted the present neglect of three-dimensional sculptural models, pointing out also that such disregard does not reflect the priorities of the early modern period. Having introduced the man... Okay, sorry. We have only to think of the crucial role played by models in the scientific revolution, and we can note that attempts were also made to reduce art to rational laws and even mathematical analysis. So on the left, you've got Henri Testolin's Table des principes de la peinture sur les proportions of 1676, and on the right, Roger de Pio's Balance des peintres of 1699, in which he calculates the relative merits of artists numerically. The porte-crayon may be to hand on the table in Drouet's 1758 portrait of Bouchardon, attesting to his talent as a draftsman, but it was the two models for the Cupid and the equestrian monument to Louis XV that speak here in the context of the Academy of his talent, status, and reputation. Moreover, in his oration to the sculptor, delivered at the Academy shortly after Bouchardon's death in 1762, it is in fact the maquettes and models that the Comte de Caylus refers to when discussing the realization of sculptural projects. Models for the group for Grosbois, the full-length Silver Virgin and angel bosses for Saint-Sulpice, for the model for the lectern for Notre Dame, and the monument for Cardinal Fleury. In the time available this morning, I will ask three questions. First, what was meant by the term model in the 18th century, and was there something particular about sculptural maquettes, or did they share properties with other kinds of models, those in science and technology, for instance? Secondly, how were they built, and how were they used? And finally, what is the relationship between models and representations? The reasons for exploring these questions with reference to fountains, and the seasons fountains in the Rue de Grenelle in particular, is that fontaine was still in the 18th century a synonym of source or spring, and therefore, figuratively speaking, of creativity and imagination. I showed, by way of illustration, a page from Gilles-Marie Oppenau's doodled copy of the first French edition of Cesare Ripa's Iconologie. Note the icon for art at the bottom right, and below it, a scene sketched by the architect in which a fountain and a jet d'eau feature prominently. The fountain represents a self-reflexive case of invention and of the process of artistic production to which models are said, within the context of art at least, naturally to belong. I've elected to talk about the Fontaine des Quatre Saisons in particular, rather than, say, the Neptune fountain at Versailles, because not only is it one of Bouchardon's major works, it is also the one in which he comes closest to engaging in matters of technology and science at a level that reaches beyond routine professional concerns with materials and techniques. It thus lends itself, it seems to me, to the consideration of models more generally. And to make one final introductory point, the fountain had, as we all know, its critics. The problems Bouchardon's gainsayers identified, those of not properly being able to see it, and of not being able to recognize it as a fountain, that is, not being able to understand it, could be described as problems arising from the model, from inadequate and incompetent modeling. If we say that, what exactly do we mean? And was it in fact the case? To return to Caylus's lecture on Bouchardon's life and works, the word model recurs throughout the text. It both refers to distinct entities and to different types of the same thing. What all these instances have in common is that they are three-dimensional. Caylus does not refer to drawings as models. Extension was thus a defining property of the model for Caylus. In this, his use of the term was perfectly conventional. Antoine de Furetière, in his Dictionnaire universel of the 1727 edition, notes that the drawings or sketches of painters are never called models, and that sculptors' models are their sketches, if you look at the bottom, the very bottom line. If we turn to the differences among models, we can note that both Furetière and Caylus acknowledge as models living and inanimate things. Furetière observes that people and actions can serve as models. Language, on the other hand, creates rules. He had in mind, of course, social, political, and ethical models for emulation. Caylus, on the other hand, records initially the humble studio model. Bouchardon's father hired a model to pose for Bouchardon every day during his pre-formative years at Chaumont. Later in the life, he proposes Bouchardon as an ideal model, in Furetière's sense, to his audience of academy students and early career sculptors. Obviously enough, when speaking of models, Caylus more often means things, the three-dimensional preparatory work involved in the making of ambitious sculpture. They are, in this context, a sign of mastery and maturity. Drawing for Caylus in the life characterizes apprenticeship, training, both with regard to manual dexterity and with furnishing the mind. He does not, therefore, identify modeling with Bouchardon's long period in Rome. And yet Bouchardon, writing to his father in January 1726, assures him that, and I quote, "Every day I model and draw after beautiful things, and from time to time I make myself invent sketches on paper and in clay in the taste of this country." Where for Caylus, drawing was the, indeed, possibly even the only instrument of learning, and modeling was the essence of making, for Bouchardon, modeling and drawing were seemingly interchangeable and equally well suited to study and to creative work. Within his class of sculptural models, Caylus identifies the following kinds: maquette, or first ideas, and second stage models. Made either of clay or of plaster, they're normally smaller than the target at which they are aimed, but occasionally, as in the case of the caryatids for the Equestrian Monument, of Louis XV, the same size. In terms of function, Caylus identifies the model primarily with process, as instantiating a relationship between the artist and the work. Secondly, he recognizes it as mediating the artist's relationship with others, those to whom his work was delegated for execution, the incompetent silversmith who travestied the sculptor's model for the Saint-Sulpice Virgin, and those for whom it was destined, the king in the case of the tomb of Cardinal Fleury. Moreover, with regard to function, the model was either active, giving rise to the ultimate copy of itself, the final work, or redundant. No finished version materializes. It was in relation to the inactive or unused models that Caylus spoke most expansively. Where the project was realized, the model was, from the point of view of narrating the life at least, surplus to requirements, superseded by the work itself. How do models for the Rue de Grenelle fountain, listed in Bouchardon's after-death inventory, fit into Caylus's typology? Although the models and drawings are grouped by subject matter or commission, they're assigned separate lots. So you don't get a single lot with both drawings and maquettes. You get either one or the other. Moreover, lots 16 and 18 respect the distinction Caylus makes between maquettes and models, or sketches and second stage models. To this distinction, the sale catalogue introduces value. The model of the principal group is singled out and named. The sketch models are generic, distinguished by material, not design, and grouped under a single item number. Finally, in the sale, we find one kind of model that not discussed by Caylus, the architectural model, lot 17, which, in the case of the fountain, does not survive. The presence of the architectural model, almost certainly not made by Bouchardon, but by a professional model maker, raises in a very direct way the second half of my first question. Was there something particular about sculptural maquettes, or did they share properties with other kinds of model, those in science and technology, for instance? Malcolm Baker has argued that, in general, 3D architectural models had a rhetorical function. Sorry. These were some of my examples of, okay, so you've got the model on the right, top right is the figure of Paris for the Rue de Grenelle fountain, and below it is the Louvre's now very clean and beautiful maquette for the figure of the Marne. And the one on the left is, again, now cleaned. These were taken from through the window at the Louvre before they were restored. So it gives you an idea of the distance we've traveled between what they used to look like and what we now have. And it is a miracle. The wax model for Cardinal Fleury's. Okay, so here are the models, architectural models. Malcolm Baker had in mind, I think, Sir Christopher Wren's great model of 1672-3. And on the right, I show you a Chalgrin's model of Saint-Sulpice at Carnavalet to give you an idea of, well, actually, I mean, it's much later than Bouchardon's model, but records what Saint-Sulpice was like when Servandoni designed it. Malcolm Baker has argued that, in general, 3D architectural models had a rhetorical function to persuade the patron to commit the vast sums of money required to turn a project into something real. Only rarely were 3D models part of the design process, which is not to say that architects did not make and use models, but to note that for architects, spatial extension was not a necessary condition of them. The engineer Bernard Forest Bellidor, whom Michel-Étienne Turgot, the prévôt des marchands responsible for the commission for the Rue de Grenelle fountain, so Bellidor, whom Turgot consulted in the late 1730s on the renovation and upgrading of the pump house on the Pont Neuf, known as the Samaritaine, submitted a redesign of the pistons on paper, which he called a model. The model I show you engraved in his Traité d'architecture hydraulique on the right. In the text, Bellidor also discusses the demonstration of a full-scale model of a pump that he, Turgot, and members of the Académie des Sciences had witnessed at Bercy in 1738, or what is called today a prototype. For him, the defining feature of the model was not its physical properties, but rather its enactability, or the purchase it has on the world. Scientific models, which included inscriptions of all kinds, from equations to diagrams and graphs plans and sections, raised conceptual and analytical questions such as, what is the relation between theory and practice? In the case of pistons, the knotty matter of friction. What truth claims are made by models? How reliable are they? What is the relation of models? What is the relation between models and the world? Sculptural models generally did not. Bouchardon's were, we think, mostly everyday objects, not apparently engaged in theory, not telling us something we don't already know. At any rate, they did not provoke, when, for instance, exhibited at the Salon, theoretical debate or give rise to controversies. They were indeed often almost below the threshold of notice. The great collector Bonnier de la Mosson displayed in his cabinet mécanique no less than 13 models of water pumps, including the modèle très ouvragé of a pump proposal for the Samaritaine by Parcieux, and a petit modèle of the pump at Bercy mentioned by Bellidor and built by Pajot d'Aussembré. Although we know that the first minister, Cardinal Fleury, responsible for one of the epic Latin inscriptions on the Rue de Grenelle fountain, had a model of it made for himself as memento, Bouchardon's Grand Modèle, on sale in 1762, fetched just 12 livres, or around the same price as an expensive reproductive print. In 1762, it's about the same price as a print after Greuze. Purchasers of his models tended to be other sculptors rather than collectors, and Kristel, I'm obviously wrong there. Philosophy of science today distinguishes between two kinds of model, the rational, abstract, and analytical model, and the narrative model. The first is dominant in physics, and especially mechanics, and the second in natural sciences. The first is predictive, able to establish how something in the world will behave on the basis of the laws it makes visible. And the second is historical, insofar as it tells the story of how, for instance, a frog becomes from egg to amphibian. Art history tends to explain models by the second route. Gerhard Weber, the first to write specifically about Bouchardon's models, assumes as his primary objective establishing the linear sequence of Bouchardon's creative process. The rationale of Weber's reconstruction is a stage process from simple origin to complex three-dimensional end. And yet his first step, unfixed and layered, seems far from simple, more complex, in fact, than the fixing of internal modeling in the final stage. And I show you, to illustrate his various four stages, the sketch, the first idea, if you like, for the font or ecclesiastical fountain at the Basilica in St. Peter's. Two drawings for four fountains, the one on the left, the Adonis fountain. This is actually the Louvre's counterproof for the drawing that was in the exhibition in Paris. and the maquette again for the river god with its accompanying drawing, and then the central portion of the Grenelle fountain serving here as the model for the sculptural model of the combination of the group of Paris, the Seine and Marne, which is lost. The trajectory that Weber traces is from interior to exterior, imagination to world, one that is naturalized, moreover, as a progress from simple, light, and dynamic first thought to stabilized, materialized, and substantive outcome. His is the story of the growth of an idea. It follows, in fact, the three-stage logic of progressive academic education: copies after prints, copies after the cast, finally, copies after life. It does not chime, however, with Caylus' account. According to him, in the case of the Neptune fountain commissioned, Bouchardon started with complex compositions involving two figures, a minor god and a siren, which he, on second thoughts, judged too large and too rich, I quote. He abridged and condensed his idea to a single figure of a Triton, figure simple, vraie et développée. In Caylus' story, Bouchardon behaved more like a scientist than a frog. He started with the mess of possibilities, particularities, and accidentals, and abstracted essential forms and prime metaphors. I don't want to dismiss the narrative dimension of the model, but rather to shift our point of view in relation to it. What if we think less about the sequence and pay attention instead to the modular qualities of the models? By modular qualities, I mean both those relating to what they are made of and what determines how they function and were used. We might, for instance, arrange them in a fourfold diagram in which dimensionality is coordinated with agency, that is, in terms of the model's action on the world. The linear sequence disappears, and so too the scholar's responsibility to establish a proper order. Instead, the capacity of the model to be forward-looking and to instigate chains of events is now understood as a function artificially, that is, artistically, built into some drawings and sculptural works, and not into others. So, how were they built, and how were they used? Weber points the way here, since, surprisingly perhaps, he identifies life drawing as the occasion for testing the 3D model. It seems to me that, ironically, his argument draws its strength from properties of the drawings that actually erase life rather than depict it. The milieu in which the model poses is clearly not the natural setting of Bouchardon's studio, but rather an abstract space or grid, virtually a plane in or on which light falls evenly and always from above left to right, and which allows him to pin his model onto the page. Moreover, although Guilhem Scherf has identified three different male models who served Bouchardon, those differences between those three models is minimized to a point that individuality is almost lost. These rendering practices transform the naked man into a docile model object, who by virtue of this normalization is easier to manipulate and use. So here I've given you two of the drawings that you can just note that very minimal changes that are made in the position of the left arm, the position of the right arm and hand, and the alignment of the feet. Models are not just the product of such rendering practices, however. They're also informed by sets of assumptions. They encode theoretical models, models about proportions and ideal form. And I have 3 minutes, so I'm going to be quite quick here. But what I want to think about is how models can be thought of as having, if you like, normalizing, normative, to incorporate more normative models, And I've selected 3 which seem to me relevant in relation to the fountain at Grenelle. First of all, proportion, the idea of ideal form. So I've compared reproductions of plates in books in Bouchardon's collection with his own drawings. So here we have Gérard Audrin's proportions of man and his drawing after the antique. It's a very simple point. More interesting, I think, if we think of it in terms of this notion of ideal or abstract principle, which, if you like, brings together things that we normally don't think of in one go. So the human figure, the classical orders from Vignola, and in the case of the right is Descartes' models of snowflakes in the Discours sur la méthode. And in all 3 instances, ideal form, the snowflakes at that point until recent research done at Caltech, snowflakes were assumed to be identical. In fact, they're very rarely identical. So in science, as in art, the idea was to discover this perfect form. So perfect form would be one. Perspective is another technology or model-making strategy which is incorporated within Bouchardon's, with which, if you like, Bouchardon builds his model, or that's what I want to argue. In this case, we have Bullet's L'Architecture Pratique, with its plate also for perspective on the right, and Dubreuil, lower left. These are 2 perspective manuals that he owned, which demonstrate not only, if you like, how a painter might use perspective plans, but also how an architect and a sculptor would. And finally, I would like you to consider thinking about iconography as a model system. It, again, like perspective and like ideal form, assumes universal intelligibility of a particular kind of practice, signifying practice rather than, if you like, formal practice. So we have ideal form, we have perception, and we have interpretation. You might well ask, why does it matter? Why do I think this is interesting in relation to the Rue de Grenelle fountain? Well, the criticism of the fountain is always in terms of an inability to see it and an inability to be able to interpret its function or what it is. So people don't recognize it as a fountain. We know, of course, that it fits into a tradition of fountain design in Paris itself. So I show you here Pierre Bullet's fountain in the Rue Saint-Martin. And on the right, an anonymous fountain, which is near the Luxembourg Gardens. And the point I want to make is, okay, so there's one way of just saying it looks like a civic fountain. I suppose the question is to say, okay, so there is a tradition of civil fountain making. What is particular about it? What I want to consider is whether or not, and it's very different, all right, to Versailles fountain design. What I want to suggest is that the final version, all right, is a model. It's not a final work. That is to say that what it does, what the final version does, is model an idea of an ideal society. So if we think of the fountain as a model, and we think of modeling or models as being on a line that can incorporate both drawings at one end and finished works at the other, and that what matters about models is what they do out in the world, then I would say the Rue de Grenelle fountain is a model. And what it does is it models what an ideal society would be, both in terms of the classical style that it adopts, in terms of the iconography that it deploys. It's an iconography which does not associate water, the provision of waterworks, with the hand of God. It is not the Samaritaine, which was the water pump, the water-providing device, which was restored at the end of the 1710s. So as, you know, it would have been a new work, and called La Samaritaine because it has had a bas-relief in lead of Christ and the woman at the well. Right? So that is an instance where water is regarded as a grace and not as a responsibility of the city, not something that the Crown and the city of Paris provides for its citizens. This is a very different idea of what civic responsibility might be. You know, so far as Turgot is concerned, this absolutely articulates what the city of Paris does for its citizens. I should say that the, oh no, how has it gone? This one, the one on the far right, its inscription is in Latin, but I won't give you the Latin. She wishes, that is the Princess Palatine, wishes that water will flow at her expense for the citizens. So the tradition is very much for that kind of civic responsibility. So iconographically, I think it works in that way. In terms of the antique, the connection that I would want to make is between hydraulics and technology, Roman technology, and the fountain. So if you read the Traité de Police by de la Mare, everything he has to say about the supply of water in Paris starts with the Romans. It is discussed in terms of canals and aqueducts. This is quite difficult to work out actually where the water is coming from. I think it's probably coming from the Pont Notre Dame. So it uses hydraulics. Hydraulics is one of the few, you know, Romans didn't use hydraulics. So it is both modern and ancient. But I think certainly that there is a tradition that goes back to Colbert of thinking about the new Rome in terms of technology, not just in terms of style. Finally, and this is perhaps more controversial, it seems to me that the inability to be able to see it adequately, for me at any rate, I'm persuaded that it's a strategy by Bouchardon to try and secure a square in front of his monument. In other words, it models itself as a sculpture on a square, and in lieu of that square, makes it extremely difficult and uncomfortable for people looking at it until such a thing happens. I was interested in Amaury Duval's publication of the fountains, publishing of Paris fountains in 1813, that he mentions, for instance, that the nearby facade of the new school of chirurgie the front of it had just been cleared so that enough space was made for a building that's going up in the 1740s to be seen properly. It is a possibility. So you would then end up, if you like, with the finished work in the top right-hand corner, plus agency, plus 3D, as a model. Thank you.
So now it is time for discussion. So I invite the 4 speakers to go there behind the tisch, the table. Speak German. So, thank you very much. Perhaps I can just begin with a few remarks. First to Katy Scott and for all the discussion around the Fontaine de Grenelle. And I agree that for Bouchardon's meaning, he has in mind the square in front of the fontaine, of course. But what is fascinating is the debate with the specialist of the architecture in Paris and with Blondel. And because Blondel drew his specific mind of the Fontaine de Grenelle and with the water, which is really in the center of his design, because when Blondel drew his project, it was printed in the encyclopedia, so with a very broad audience. And in Blondel's drawing, the water comes from the center of the fountain. So really, it was all a debate with the role of the public monument and the water in Paris. And even if, of course, the Rue de Grenelle was narrow, but it was really the conception itself of the public monument. And so it was one of the most fascinating debate in Paris in the middle of the 18th century.
I mean, I suppose what I was trying to suggest that that the problems with the fountain was that it was a contentious model in the end, and that what it was trying to do was not as a result of a failure to model properly, but a distinctive choice to model differently. Mm-hmm. And fountains were model objects, that is to say that they are used. I mean, Descartes, works out optics of the rainbow from a rainbow fountain, and the way he also worked out, mechanical calculations on the forms of the parabola from. So fountains have that resonance as being, if you like, model objects that you might use in particular ways. And I agree. I mean, of course, Blondel, has a very particular view. In the 1730s, the context is one of drought. 1731, there's a drought. 1735, you look through the Académie des Sciences, they're publishing treatises on how to deal with France's provisioning, or Paris's provisioning of water. And it seems to me that the enclosure of water, I mean, water is there, is modeled by the model, but it's modeled as something which is kept precious, that is contained, which is not wasted, and which is not displayed, which is a very different way of thinking of that monument as actually enclosing something. Rather than displaying something. One can agree or disagree. But it seems to me that there is a choice being made, and it's not just that he doesn't know how to design a fountain, which is one way of
yes, lovely. And I have a remark with you, and I will leave, of course, all people to speak.
I'm ready for correction.
No, of course not. No, because it is the links between Bouchardon and what you call the market of sculpture. Yes, and what is it's just a remark, right? And what is fascinating with Bouchardon and the link with sculptures are as small objects for collectors. It is disdain for the bronze reductions, for example. Yes. So it is very fascinating that we know only one example of bronze reductions after it is for the genius in Versailles, but he was very interested to the diffusion of his style with the prints after his drawings, but not really after his own models. But even if a lot of amateurs around him were keen for having models and as gifts, or even if they pay for models. For example, I'm sure that Julienne paid the sketch model after the Salon of 37, but that is quite distinctive for knowing his personality, that is disdain for that
in contrast
duplication.
To
yes, exactly.
Yes.
For example, Falconet, for example, or even Pigalle.
Yes, he seems to stand apart in that and other ways.
Yes, exactly. So please, if you have some remarks to the speakers. Yes.
I would just like to continue for 1 minute about the Rue de Grenelle fountain. And Katie, I was really interested in this idea that not just stylistically, but in terms of water engineering, that it was expressing a debt to Roman precedent. And I was wondering, not being an expert on how water was moved in France at this time, but around this time, weren't many of the contemporaries of Bouchardon traveling to Arcueil to draw the Gardenier? And isn't it true that actual remnants of Roman water engineering were the foundation? Like at Arcueil, isn't the aqueduct was an actual Roman aqueduct that was then built on top of, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I just wonder if there's not just a conceptual debt, but that French waterworks actually were literally, and in the south of France too, built on top of Roman. I just hadn't thought, it was a very interesting point that I hadn't thought about before.
I mean, and there are those who think that the water comes from Arcueil, which would make the connection with the aqueducts, with you know, an aqueduct of Roman origin, absolutely, you know, meaningful and resonant in the context of the Rue de Grenelle fountain. I think it probably comes from the Pont Neuf, from the Pont Notre Dame, in fact, and hydraulics. But the point is that discussions around Roman technology and the relationship between ancients and moderns, whether aqueducts or hydraulic machines, are things which are much in discussion at that particular point. And I would find it unusual that people didn't have that in mind. Never mind the fact that, you know, most of the discussion that we have is, or the criticism that we have, is voiced by people on an aesthetic basis and not on the grounds of other issues. I mean, I find it interesting that Turgot is in effect, I mean, Malcom made this point that, that models, that very often the people who are looking at sculptural models are also looking at scientific models. And in that case, absolutely, that, you know, Etienne Turgot, who is a friend of Bouchardon, certainly by the end, is the same man who's going out to Bercy and watching someone, you know, playing around with pistons and looking at models for those sorts of things, as he is the person who's looking at sculptural models. And the kind of overlap between those two things seems to me very interesting.
They've just been institutionally divided, so that there are different types of institutions. The Science Museum and not the V&A.
Yes.
London terms.
The Louvre.
Yes, I would like to ask something to Malcolm Baker because of his interesting talks about some ways of carving out a sculptural career, and ask him what he thinks about the role of prints. Because it is very interesting when you compare Roubillac, Bouchardon and Pigalle that we have many, many more prints after drawings and sculptures of Bouchardon than of the others. And I haven't counted them really, but there are about at least 300 after Bouchardon's work and his drawings. And I would like to ask your opinion of how do you think that those prints that were not commissioned by Bouchardon but by other people played a role in carving out his career?
Yes, so he's not the agent here in terms of So what are they for, and who does commission them? Sorry, I'm asking you because you'll know the answer, not me. Well, in a sense, there's a broader question here, isn't there, about who actually shapes a career, or the idea of a career, and I suppose that has to do also with the construction of biographies and who's involved in that. So perhaps there's a sort of the production of the prints and the replication of the prints goes with the writing of artistic biography. And are they the same people? I mean, were they used? No, they weren't used to illustrate. No. But they say they have an independent life, but perhaps a parallel life.
Yeah, well, they played, of course, a major role in advocating and making known what someone made, because the sculpture is in a physical place, it's in one place, and of course the prints went over the entire world.
Yes.
But it's interesting that there were certain publishers and certain engravers or patrons like Le Contemporaries who saw an interest in Bouchardon's work and tried to diffuse it.
Right.
And I think that is a fascinating element, that there were a number of key players in that culture that took on his works and not that of others, you see, or more his work than that of other sculptors.
Is it a question of that distinctive classicizing style, the ideal that it represented, that had more didactic uses
No. No, it is the link with Uquier, for example. You spoke in Paris about that, so he is a very key personality.
Right, yes.
And there is no link with a discussion about the style, because with Uquier it is another strategy.
But he diffuses the art of Bouchardon only as a draftsman and not as a sculptor. Because we don't have prints produced, correct me if I'm wrong, we don't have prints produced after, for instance, Cupid, do we?
No.
And no, so it's quite, you know,
yes,
it's also a different kind of, because on the opposite, what I showed of the only prints we know by De la Valle after a drawing he did is, I think, a true promotion that the artist does for his own group, which failed completely because that group was still in the sculptor's house when he died. But I truly think that when De la Valle does this print with the indication of Niccolò Gaburri, who was a very important patron of the arts, he tried to promote his art because his career was taking off very slowly, using a theme of children, because Rusconi, his master, had been very well received as a sculptor for putties, having even British collectors buying these 4 seasons, which are now in the Royal Collection of England. So the prints for Bouchardon are only related to his career as a draftsman and not as his career as a sculptor, although it may have served anyway, for the fame of his name.
Yes, but with the Fauteuil de Grenelle, so we have some very interesting prints, yes.
And the Louis XV monument.
Mm. With the earliest tracks on the chalk manner engraving or printmaking, the very earliest tracks say, it's too bad that students, until the invention of this technique that copied the red chalk drawing, too bad that students had to copy engravings because their drawings would end up being dry and boring and inaccurate. But with the chalk manner engraving, they can see, and they name these 3 artists. They can see Raphael, they can see the Carracci, and they can see Bouchardon. So his reputation, this is in the 1750s already. Yes.
Seizing the moment.
Thank you very much for your lectures. As a complete novice regarding sculpture, I noticed my reactions to Roubiliac and Pigalle as seeing those sculptures as very emotionally accessible, whereas the Bouchardon had more of a emotional distance, but still very incredibly instructive as to the classical style. I was wondering if you could speak to that. In particular, the Pigalle had sort of, and I think that you mentioned that, the ephemeral quality that was expressed in the sculpture, where you could really see this child as a child, not just as a sculpture. And whereas the Bouchardon has sort of an eternal quality about it.
Yes. There's a sort of immediacy about some of the works by Pigalle and by Roubiliac. And in a sense, I think one of the problems, this is more of a sort of perhaps an art historical problem, that we see those, to put it very crudely, we see those styles as being more typical of that period. So there's a difficulty in actually placing Bouchardon. That isn't quite what you're saying, but it's sort of related. It's as if we can. Bouchardon has been admired, but not perhaps until this exhibition, not loved.
This was fascinating, and one learned so much from all 4 talks. But I want to follow up on this provocative idea, Katie, that you proposed for the fountain as a model, which I thought was really compelling. But there was one thing that I was wondering about as you were listing the elements that speak for it doing something as a model, which seemed to me the most compelling to me, which is the very structure of it, which is so strange. So much architecture, so little sculpture, in a way, right? And I wonder whether that had something to do, the way in which he so conspicuously staged the sculpture as an element of a certain kind of arrangement that is architecturally spelled out, as opposed to sculpturally, whether that had something to do with that idea of it functioning as a model that so, you know, you so vividly diagrammatized, you know, as consisting of elements and therefore being possibly combinatory and therefore could be read not narratively.
Yeah, that's
right?
Interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. I've got to think some more about the architectural element to it, because it's quite difficult to, you know, I mean, in an ideal world, you know, people would be offended by the facade on the grounds that it's, I don't know, that it's inappropriately severe, let's say. In fact, the complaints about the facade relate to the possibility that it actually looks more like an interior than an exterior. And this is in the context of a lot of the problems to do with water supply in Paris, owing to the fact that private individuals would siphon off water from pipes in the way that, you know, you see photographs of Beirut where people take electricity from the main electricity supply and divert it into their own homes. Well, that's what people were doing in 18th century Paris, not least because the Prévôt des Marchands would sell concessions that they were not entitled to so that people could have private water. So the issue of whether water is public or private is part of the debate about the provisioning of water generally. So what we're to make about the suggestion that somehow the way in which he creates this space, whether it's supposed to be water for private use, provide publicly, or quite what's going on there. And as you say, I mean, what you were talking about was a much more general question, which has less to do, if you like, with the iconography or the meaning of particular motifs, and more to do with the way in which the facade functions. But I think this idea, the way in which it's discussed is a retreat from the streets, a Bouchardon stepping back, being in retreat, so almost as if it's a large niche on the street. What does a large niche mean? You know, how do we relate this idea of a niche to a square? I don't know. I just think there's something going on. That's all.
Yeah. I just wanted to follow up on Katie's really interesting idea about the Fontaine de the Rue de Grenelle and its relationship to the Trevi fountain, which is what it's usually been, in a sense, likened to because of Bouchardon's earlier projects for that. And your thesis or your idea sort of turns it a little bit into a kind of anti-Trevi fountain, I think. And whereas the Trevi fountain is all about the flow of the water, very, very public, the reservoir, in a sense, becomes what's so important in the Grenelle fountain, which I thought was, I'd never thought of it that way until your paper. The other thing that I just wanted to sort of ask maybe you to reflect on is Mariette's text about the fountain, which seems not impossible that it was written in some consultation with the artist. Never brings up this idea of a future square, but it would have fit very well into the argument that text makes, because that text is all about how the fountain presages a new, you know, embellissement of the city. The fountain itself is presented as a temple being built for the personification of Paris that sort of suggests that the inhabitants of Paris are soon going to have a temple built to them in the form of a new Paris.
Yeah, a new Rome. I mean, it's, you know, it's a theme that has currency, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, it just seems interesting to me. I love the idea that that there was a square somehow kind of hinted at there, and the idea of the École de Chirurgie is a perfect parallel to that. But I'm slightly worried about the fact that Mariette didn't see fit to sort of say, and hey, be patient. You know, maybe just like we're going to rebuild Paris, we're also maybe going to rebuild the area in front of this fountain.
Well, I mean, legally speaking, of course, the crown has a compulsory purchase powers. It was possible. The crown could simply decide to buy and knock down the space in front of the Rue de Grenelle fountain. It doesn't do it because, you know, it's impolitic to do such a thing. It chooses on the whole not to. So, you know, when the same arguments come up with the square for the Place Louis XV, again, they choose an area which doesn't involve that kind of intervention. But they could have done, and Bouchardon certainly knew that they could.
It is also true that the land for the Fontaine de Grenelle, the idea of the fountain goes back about 15 to 20 years, and they spent a really long time acquiring what little piece of land they had. So
yeah, it's not impossible that could have gone on.
I have a question for Kristel Smentek. I was fascinated by your discussion of Bouchardon's pursuit or embodiment of a specifically Greek classical ideal. And what it sort of, perhaps this is a non sequitur, but what it made me think about was, you know, a century earlier, François Duquesnoy. And Duquesnoy seems to be quite present in, for example, the reliefs of Putti that Bouchardon makes. I was just wondering what the connection
So I presented him the way Laugier presented him as the new Phidias, but he is also presented as the new Duquesnoy. Because, and this is, I'm relying here on an amazing book by Estelle Lingo, which shows that in the circle of Duquesnoy, Poussin in the 17th century, they really are trying to figure out what the Greek ideal is. And a lot of what their work is recorded in manuscripts, which Mariette had copies of. So they weren't published until the later 18th century, but he had manuscript copies of them. So it's both. I mean, so it's the Greek ideal filtered through, you know, Renaissance naturalism, but also through these intensive artistic research, this research in Rome in the 17th century, which he was extremely aware of. And as you know, I think Bouchardon, not just because of the reliefs in the Grenelle fountain, but he's repeatedly compared to Duquesnoy. So it isn't just the Putti, it's the ideal that Duquesnoy embodies for some of these people who are very invested in figuring out what the Greek ideal is, and he represents that for them.
Yes, thank you. I have a question for Kristel, which is about the sort of this interest in gems and the small scale, about the continuity between Bouchardon in Rome with Storch and Mariette, and because there's an overlap between Bouchardon's sitters in Rome and the sitters who had medals and wax portraits produced by Pozzo and ivory. So there's that link with the small scale already early on.
I mean, one of the sort of, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Bouchardon is very involved, at least to some degree, with Stosch, and Baron von Stosch published the most important treatise on engraved gems in 1724, which, if I'm not mistaken, Bouchardon owned also. I mean, many people owned it. It was the text previous to the Treatise, I would say. So he's already embedded in that milieu before he comes to Paris, and I think maybe in some sense that gives him an additional kind of legitimacy to take on this project. I mean, there are multiple reasons that I think that he's asked to do this, but certainly, you know, he's in that antiquarian community in Rome already. And I think, Edouard, don't you speculate that maybe he drew for Stosch some of the gems?
There's a reference saying that Stosch actually learned draftsman. Italian, German, French would come and study works in his collection, and it's implied from that reference that Bouchardon was one of them. Heisler was another one.
Yeah. I mean, they're not on our radar, but they were on,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Yeah.
They were on almost
Yes,
anyone who was
absolutely,
interested
yes.
in antiquities
Yeah.
radar, so to speak.
This is a question that was stimulated by Katie's talk on the model, but I realize it actually is maybe relevant to a couple of the talks, which is taken in a totally maybe different direction in terms of authorship and the problem of authorship for sculpture, often because it's a workshop that is producing the marble, because of the difficulty of working the marble. And I guess maybe starting with Katie is particularly the diagram of where, at what point does the model's proximity to the maker matter in a way that it doesn't matter in other realms, in science, etc. Because Bouchardon seems to have a particularly close affiliation with the surface of his works, and there are very few of them, etc. He's not interested in replicas in that way. I guess what, if any, role that authorship might...
Do you want me to start?
Or if it's important at all. I mean, maybe the model exists outside of, once it's been given, it has this.
I've thought about it a little bit in the case of the Rue de Grenelle fountain, because it seemed to me that I started and then didn't pursue this idea that fountain as a spring is associated with artistic creativity and becomes a kind of motif for artistic creativity. And you could look at some of Bouchardon's drawings for fountains which were clearly never in the offing for actual realization as exactly that, as a kind of inventive practice which speaks to his own artistic skills. What's interesting about the Rue de Grenelle is that it isn't a fountain of that kind, and so the presence of his signature in the inscription seems to me to be quite suggestive. And to me, the way I've been thinking about it at the moment is that it's an instance where he classes himself with the échevin, that he sees himself as engaged in a collaborative project with the échevin, and where he has a role to play like them as a civic, as somebody with a civic duty that he is performing. Now, I mean, I suspect the Rue de Grenelle fountain is a one-off. But at any rate, I mean, what I'd like to consider, if you like, is that along with courtly culture, of which the amour is quintessential, there's a different Bouchardon, right, who is also interested in civil projects and who has a different voice, which is meaningful for a different constituency, because we tend to think of him always in terms of Mariette and Caylus and collectors. But I think there is somebody there who is also working for the church, who's also working for the city of Paris, and who has a very strong voice with those constituencies too. And that maybe if we get more of a sense of that, or just draw attention to it more.
Mm-hmm. I suppose also, just this is modeled in a different sort, the more conventional terracotta model. I mean, when Mariette, he owns a lot of them by Bouchardon, and he says of terracottas, not specifically about Bouchardon, but in general, that the reason one wants them is because they show the artist at work. So they're analogous to drawings, right? They show the artist unmediated by studio, by patron even, in some sense, if that speaks to your...
It does, but I think I've seen specifically of sculptors' limitations of how close they can be to the final product.
Someone else? No? So, it is the end of the morning, so the next appointment is at 2:30, session number 2. Thank you.